Good afternoon and welcome to everybody here in Yerevan and to everybody watching online. You're all very welcome indeed to this panel on creating the right legal frameworks to support renewable energy projects. My name is David Shukman, and for many years I was a BBC News correspondent covering climate change and renewable energy. And it's extraordinary to think how far we've come. 15, 20 years ago, solar and wind were quite expensive, didn't work very well. It wasn't completely clear that they'd ever be a plausible alternative to fossil fuels. Fast forward to the last few years, and we've seen unbelievable falls in the prices of wind and solar in particular, so that these technologies have become very plausible. And some of you may have seen in the last few days an estimate by a British consultancy that last year 30% of global electricity was generated by renewable sources, partly explained by the rapid rise of wind and solar. So I think that shows us that we can do this. A low-carbon transition in energy is possible, but there's a but coming. And the but is that time is against us. And those of you who've read the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change know that we have to do everything with renewables much, much faster on a bigger scale to displace fossil fuels as rapidly as possible. And so there's a number of reasons why that pace of change perhaps hasn't yet been achieved. We know the tech exists, that's been proven. We know the willingness is there, we've seen that. But there are a number of obstacles or roadblocks which in some places have slowed down the rollout of these absolutely critical technologies. And I mentioned that time is against us because anybody seeing the news really any day now knows that we're living in a more hostile climate. Look at Dubai, the floods in Brazil, the ridiculous heat in Southeast Asia right now. We're entering new territory. So the imperative to get the renewables deployment right is absolutely there. And one potential issue, which could be an enabler, should be an enabler, is getting the right legal frameworks in place to encourage and accelerate this absolutely critical deployment. Now, during the course of this session, we're very keen to hear from you here in Yerevan with your observations and questions, and everybody online as well. And we do have the technology to do that. It's called Slido. You're probably all familiar with this. You point your cameras on your phones at the QR code, or if you've got the app, just type in that passcode number, and that'll allow you to submit a question. It should reach me here on this iPad, and during the course of the session, and particularly towards the end, we'll try to get to your comments and submissions there. We've assembled a great panel, actually, to discuss this question. So let me just introduce them right now, in no particular order, but just because they're in a row sitting next to me. Bertrand Walkenard is Deputy CEO of the French Development Agency. Before that, he held a number of senior positions in a variety of ministries in Paris, Economy and Finance, the French Treasury, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So great to have you with us. Next along is Milica Zatezalo-Falatar, who's a project finance partner with the law firm Clifford Chance. And she specializes at the moment in energy and infrastructure, particularly on the Caucasus, Central Asia and Europe generally. So we're very pleased to have you with us. Next along is Bob Davis, who's a senior counsel in the Office of the General Counsel of the EBRD. And he's been busy working on a number of renewable energy projects for the EBRD. And last but not least, Bruce Johnson, very good to have you with us. He's a director of corporate finance and treasury at the renewable energy company Masdar, based in the UAE. Bruce has 20 years' experience of advising on and structuring non-recourse project financing. In a second, I'm going to ask them all just to make an introductory remark or two so you know where they're coming from. But just to give us a flavour of what we're talking about, let's take a look at some of the renewable projects that the EBRD has been involved in. So that gives us a little snapshot of some of the projects that the EBRD has been involved in. I'm going to ask our panelists now just to make a brief introductory remark about their perspective. I mean, Bertrand, let's start with you. When you think of this question of the right legal framework to enable renewable energy projects, what's uppermost in your mind? What's the big deal there?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I just would like to echo the presentation we had in the EBRD movie, reflecting on the need to have a competitive environment. It is crucial for energy efficiency, for fiscal efficiency, for spending efficiency. So all the provisions in the law, in the contracts that enable that kind of competitive environment are, in our view, absolutely important for the deployment of this type of energy production.
Thank you, and we'll come back and explore that point in greater detail. Melissa, what's on your mind when you think of that question, and perhaps inspired by the beautiful video?
Yeah, I guess for me it's
and
really
just hold the mic. Yeah, that's it.
For me, it's really finding the right balance between certainty of some of the key provisions, especially those that are relevant for project completion, but also then revenue generation. So certainty is key of the legal framework and the provisions, but then also balancing that with a degree of flexibility, because those are typically very long-term projects, 15, 20, 30 years. Someone mentioned in the previous panel that this is a marriage, essentially, and it is a marriage oftentimes between public partners, private partners, people coming from various jurisdictions and also various cultures. And so it is something that the legal framework needs to have mechanisms to adapt over time and go through challenges if they exist, and they naturally will exist in such a long-term partnership. So it's really finding that right balance between certainty and flexibility of the framework.
Like a good and long marriage.
Yeah.
So Bob, what's your overriding priority when you come to this question?
So I think from my perspective, it's all about getting the right risk allocation. You know, we want an appropriate transfer of risk to the private sector, but not in such a way that deters investment. So if too much risk is passed on to the private sector, it can lead to increased prices and might deter investment entirely. And even if developers are willing to go ahead, they may struggle to find financing on adequate terms, and it may delay the whole process. But equally, we don't want too much risk to sit with the public sector, because it undermines the justification in the first place of involving the private sector and can create moral hazard, and also is not sustainable. And just picking up on that sustainability point, I think one of the things that we're also focused on is trying to create a risk allocation which doesn't just work for one project, but actually works to enable a much greater concentration of renewable power in the power sector. And probably just one final point as well is just, obviously the right risk allocation can change over time as well. It will evolve as markets, develop and investor confidence increases.
Great, thank you very much. And Bruce, what's on your mind when you think about this question of the legal frameworks?
I just agree with everything that everybody said that went before me. I don't think the right legal framework is not the perfect legal framework, right? Because the perfect legal framework may exist, but it will take us an incredibly long time to get there, right? And I think you have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, right? Which is we're talking about the right legal framework for renewable energy projects, which represents one of the chief ways in which we're going to ensure that this Earth is still inhabitable in 30 years' time. So if we're striving for perfection, we'll find, probably won't be able to go outside in 2050 or 2060 because none of these projects ever happened, or they didn't happen at the speed and scale that they need to happen. So for me, like others have said on the panel, it's about not striving for perfection, it's looking for balance, and it's making sure that we can get these projects done as quickly as possible.
So let's pick up actually with you, Bruce, and develop that. So as you're looking at Masdar, at potential projects, if you're looking to develop them, obviously there's a whole range of factors that'll concern you. How large does getting the legal framework right, or operating in the right framework, loom on the list of all the myriad things that you'll have to contend with before going ahead?
It's a consideration. It's probably not the number one consideration that attracts us to a market or a particular project, but it certainly makes things way easier if what we're being presented with looks incredibly familiar, right? Because as an institution, we've learned how things should look. We've gotten comfortable with how certain legal frameworks in different jurisdictions have looked. We've done our due diligence and we've been able to bank those deals. And we've built them and they're operating and, we're hopefully making some money from them. So when it comes to something new, I'd like for it to, or as an institution, we want for it to look exactly the same as before.
Do you mean by new, do you mean a new jurisdiction?
New jurisdiction, but sometimes it's the case, David, that it can be in the same jurisdiction, but you find that maybe it's the financiers or the procurers, people are, for one reason or another, looking to change things. So the legal framework for the last deal may not necessarily look exactly the same as the legal framework that was in place for the previous one, which then obviously involves us having to go through a whole process of, does this work or not? Sometimes it doesn't work, and then we end up in a situation where we've got to negotiate, and that leads to the delays. And these are projects that we need to save the planet. I just feel like, take a big picture view, everyone. Would it not be much smarter just to do what we did before? It worked then, it should work now.
But just to follow that up, presumably picking up Melitza's point about the need for flexibility, that there may be things that in a second iteration could improve the bankability of a project.
I think improvement is sometimes overrated, to be honest with you, David.
You just want a production line where everything's
we need
the same.
Honestly speaking, I think we need almost a militaristic approach to doing renewable energy projects, and that means like zealous adherence to standardization across jurisdictions to do these projects. Because like I said, they represent one of the best chances we have of limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5. Like, that's a fact.
Okay, let's pick up on that point with you, Bob. When you hear that argument from Bruce, it's very compelling, particularly if you look at what's happening to the planet right now, that let's just have one system, keep applying it. But how does that play with you?
I mean, I think it's a very, Masdar are a huge and important developer in the region, so I think it's really important to take on board what they have said and to recognise that actually in order to scale up renewables, that is a pathway to rapid deployment. But I also think it's important to bear in mind that there are differences between legal frameworks. So sometimes trying to replicate what you've achieved in one jurisdiction might not work so well in another jurisdiction, or there may be, for example, certain jurisdictions which have already achieved a certain level of market liberalisation which allows them to transfer more risk onto the public sector. So I think we also have to, recognise that the underlying legal frameworks are different, and perhaps different jurisdictions maybe have slightly different objectives. But, it's essential also not to forget that we don't sort of strike and strive for something which will be perfect in the future and then forget to actually develop projects in the instant in the first place. So, it's a difficult balance, but I think there is a balance to be struck between standardization and also, recognizing underlying legal systems and what individual countries are trying to achieve.
Melissa, when you hear that, I mean, is it achievable to achieve a simpler and standardized mass production model where there's just one document, it serves everywhere, or we're always going to have a situation where times change or you're in different jurisdictions and you're going to have a bespoke legal system?
I think to a large extent there are things that can be standardized, but it is important that when you do that standardization, it cannot be right that it's just a copy-paste. And sometimes actually by copying and pasting from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, you end up with these legal transplants, essentially, that don't work, because people that will have to implement, judges, institutions, etc., simply do not understand these concepts. And so I think that while generally on the contractual side, it is great to have a degree of standardization, and it is helpful for everyone, I do think that for some of the issues, especially on the legal framework side rather than the contractual, there has to be a surgical approach and the respect of each country's legal background and history to make it work.
What do you mean surgical? I mean,
in surgical, so for example, you could say there is no PPA contract standard in this country. There is something which is very short and simple. One approach could be, let's take that from another country that we have just done, and another approach could be to say, let's work with what this country has, try to come to the same legal position in terms of risk allocation, but respecting what that country already has and what the institutions can understand. So as long, if the institutions and the understanding and those that will apply these contracts can understand that and know how it fits, for example, with their grid codes, with their civil law, if it's a civil law jurisdiction, that is perfectly fine. But doing transplants that essentially don't really work, it's not going to help. But I do agree that, creating beautifully crafted laws shouldn't be an objective. And what should be an objective is essentially to craft something that is an enabler to having more projects, right? So, yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. And Bertrand, from your perspective, what is the role, do you see, of international public finance in getting these renewable projects off the ground?
To start with, I represent IFD, which is a group made of 3 companies. Proparco, who is represented in this room and works with the private sector. IFD, working with states and state-owned enterprises. And Expertise France, whose purpose is to provide technical cooperation. And what we try to achieve is mobilizing these 3 institutions, and the energy sector is a good example of what we can achieve, in working on the trajectory, the energy trajectory of a country. So all of our teams are dedicated to finding what will be the share of renewable energy in Senegal, in Uzbekistan, in any other countries in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And this is how we start to work with a country, looking at what will be the energy mix in the years to come. We are also focused on the organizational structure of the state. Is it the right balance between private actors and public actors? You obviously need a regulator, and you need a strong regulator in a country to balance prices, investments, and to regulate the energy mix in that country. So this is something we focus on. And we work with private actors, and we spend a lot of time with Proparco, with EBRD, and with other partners trying to understand what is the legal framework of a country, what is the legislative environment, what are the fiscal barriers, the customs also always as well barriers that will prevent the development of a solar panel field or any other kind of renewable project. And I remember that discussion we had during a meeting with a French developer who was saying that they had been working in an African country for 3 or 4 years, and this is the time it had taken them to understand the local legislation and then to be able to have a discussion with this country to encourage the evolution and the adjustments of local laws to enable private investors to be able to come. This is the kind of situation where public financiers such as AFD, EBRD, the World Bank can spur private investments by having a dialogue with the client country and by encouraging that client country to adjust its legislation, its local laws and so on, so that it will give predictability and it will in the end enable the standardization that you were referring to.
So to pick up on Bruce's point, what are the steps you see to accelerating deployments? How do you envisage enabling the institutions to foster a faster deployment?
The first layer, in my view, is going back to what I was saying, the trajectory of the country. What does coal represent in its energy production as of today? What does oil, gas represent as of today? And what are the commitments that they made under the Paris Agreement, and where do they want to be in 5, 10, 15 years? Once you have a view as clear as possible on this, then you can start working on different aspects of the local legislation, working with the private sector, and trying to find at the same time the projects where you will be able to invest, but also that the legislation that will have to be put in place to, for instance, reform state-owned enterprises when they control a share of the market which is too big and which will prevent the private sector from investing, in order to put in place this competitive environment that will enable private players to come in.
And Bob, what do you see as the role of an institution like the EBRD in trying to create a landscape that's more enabling?
So I think at EBRD we are very committed to policy dialogue and technical assistance to try and roll out renewables across our countries of operation. So probably within the renewable space, our main activity would be under our renewable energy program, where we are trying to support countries to run competitive bidding processes to tender power projects. And at the moment, I think we've got over 15 auctions running in multiple countries across the region. And so there, what we're trying to do is give assistance to governments in trying to structure their auctions in such a way that it will attract the private sector and achieve an appropriate transfer of risk. And also, we are sort of at the same time looking at accompanying that with legal and regulatory reform. So, for example, last year, I think in Serbia, we had a very successful auction, which EBRD, under EBRD's renewable energy program, which I think resulted in over 400 megawatts of wind being auctioned and was the largest tender in the Western Balkans. And that's then supported alongside legal reforms, which will then enable these projects to be developed in a way where increasingly we are taking risk away from the public sector. So, for example, in Serbia, you know, the creation and the development of more liberalized and competitive markets allows developers to sell directly to the market rather than necessarily needing to always rely on government PPAs. And I think we view that as a really essential step towards the scaling up of renewable energy, because it, you know, ultimately there is a limit to how much fiscal headroom individual countries will have to provide government backstop PPAs. And so moves that can allow for liberalization can actually help to scale up renewable energy by taking some of the burden off the public sector.
So it is, in your view, the international institutions like the EBRD that can have that engagement with governments to try and bring about those sorts of reforms. Bruce, in terms of the urgency of the timetable you've outlined and the need to crack on and not get too perfectionist about this, when you hear about reforms, you hear about political engagement and dialogue, do you think actually that's really, really useful and it's a kind of engagement that really an international multilateral development bank can do and help with? Or do you think, we haven't got time for that?
I sort of agree and disagree. I feel like if an alien visited planet Earth and saw that we were facing this climate crisis, one of the first things they would probably say is, well, all the people ought to get together and like come up with solutions to this problem. And I guess the good news is that is actually happening. And all these kind of reforms, etc., I guess are part of that because they enable the solution to be applied quicker, right? But at the same time, I feel like, do you know that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, like Don't Look Up, right? But the meteor is fast approaching the Earth. The situation we're facing is a little bit like that, right? Or you didn't mention this at the outset, but David is working on a book at the moment, right? And we had a sort of an exchange before the panel about this, you know, the story of the frog. You put it in a pan of water and you bring it slowly to the boil, and the frog will just remain in the water as it gets hotter and hotter until eventually it boils alive, right? Well, the good news is that's not true. It's just an urban legend. The frog does eventually, as it gets pretty hot, leap out, right? It's also good that we're, as human beings, a bit smarter than the frog. We have enough foresight to see that in a certain number of years' time, the Earth will potentially become uninhabitable, right? And so we know that we need to leap out. And we kind of know today what are the things that we need to do to leap out. And we just have to do it. We just have to like take it upon ourselves and just do things quicker. So all these things are good, right? I live in the real world. You could argue that in the meteor situation, forget legal frameworks, forget developers making money, forget all these kind of social constructs that we're familiar with. Like, if you want to stop the meteor hitting the planet or you want to save the planet, like, none of these things are all that important. We just need to get on with doing things in a militaristic fashion. But in the real world, right, we will have to make sure we have the right legal frameworks, the reforms, et cetera, and things will happen at the pace they happen at. But I think the pace needs to be sped up.
What specifically, when you think of legal issues in a practical sense, are the ones that need to be sped up?
Like examples, the practical examples.
You needn't name any countries, but just what kinds of things, just to share with the audience, what kinds of things matter to you?
It's not really the legal frameworks, it's more the people. I find like people have sort of created the climate crisis. It wasn't the elephants or the giraffes, you know, or the mice or anyone else, right? It was us. We've created the problem. We've got to come up with a solution. But oftentimes it's people themselves that are getting in the way. It's personality that's getting in the way. It's ego getting in the way. It's people looking to do a better deal than last time. It's people looking to improve the risk allocation versus what the predecessor was able to achieve on the government side. But I just think, forget all that. That's probably what I see standing in the way most often. And so if you just kind of swept all of that to one side and literally rinsed and repeated what has successfully worked in the past, we'd all be the better for it.
Melissa, I caught your eye during some of what Bruce was saying.
She's heard these speeches so many times.
I mean, do you recognise any of what Bruce is saying in terms of, well, how do we achieve, get onto the road to some kind of standardisation in order to accelerate, and the extent to which there is perhaps a desire in its human nature to squeeze out a slightly better deal each time?
Yes, I think that there is, and that's quite important to keep that under control. And we have seen, for example, projects, let's say there is an issue, right? The project is in construction or is already operating. There is an event of force majeure.
So what kind of thing? Just give me an example.
You can have, for example, a tunnel collapse
right.
Linked to an FM event or not, right? Any difficult situation where essentially everyone needs to get in a room or for example, you have a change in law. You have a change in law. Everyone agrees there is a change in law. There is a provision about change in law, and everyone agrees that, okay, the government would need to pay partly now, partly in installments, and we agree to that. And we're about to sign agree on how we're going to take this forward, and then someone comes up and says, I've been looking into this change in law provision that we've drafted 10 years ago, and I don't see, for example, things that relate to a pandemic. And that's very relevant now. So let's try to improve that force majeure clause. But for example, our force majeure has nothing to do in this particular instance about pandemic. It was related to change in law. And so I think it's really important to, when there is an issue, to essentially remain focused and not distracted by other issues and various ideas which may be really, really interesting, but will not help the resolution of that specific issue that we need to resolve and just get on. But, I mean, and there, I do agree. I do agree with Bruce. But at the same time, I'm a lawyer, and we like detail, and we like perfection, and that's just life. And I don't want to lose my job. But yeah, essentially, that reminds me of this. I think it's a French Voltaire proverb that said, "Perfection is the enemy of good." And in what we do, I think it's really important to as much as we can, take a step back and understand that the legal framework, the contractual framework, is not a goal in itself. It's not our goal to create golden contracts or golden laws that we can put in our room, but it's an enabler for something to happen and for the renewables to be implemented more quickly, in a larger scale, etc. So that bit is quite important, but sometimes...
Let me just ask, it just occurred to me, actually, and it's not something we've planned at all, but when you're sitting in a long meeting with all the parties, and then someone says, oh, yeah, subclause 4G about the pandemic, do you just, I mean, and given what you know about the climate crisis and the urgency of the response that's required, I mean, do you or someone else say, look, hang on, can we just move on?
I leave that to Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, we do. And what happens,
obviously, I know Bruce would say...
It's not that subclause.
If it comes from my client,
yes, I'm thinking
then I respect my client, and maybe I do it in a breakout room. But yes, I actually try to do it, because I think it is part of our roles as lawyers when we act for big consortia involving various institutions coming from various jurisdictions to also set a bit a direction of travel and to ensure that we are essentially all together going towards the same goal, because it is in no one's interest to take a very long time to get a deal to financial close. It is in no one's interest to have deals that are delayed in terms of completing, in terms of starting revenue generation. It's not, the government wants to get electricity. the investor wants to get their dividend at one point of time, and the lenders wants to get repaid. So there is no one party that is interested in creating these complexities. And I do see our role as enabling that dialogue.
Because, I mean, I think so often in this transition, and given the time frame, you know, we probably need to enter a period where there are some difficult conversations, where, you know, where with a client relationship or whatever, there's a certain urgency that's injected into the discussion. Bertrand, when you hear this debate, how do you see your role as an enabler, and particularly accelerating deployments? When you hear this whole set of questions about, you know, there could be just one person from one party that raises an issue and that adds delay, is there a role, do you think, for an institution like yours to act as a kind of catalyst or a deal breaker, not breaker, a deal accelerator?
Well, first of all, I think the energy sector is one interesting sector because it provides concrete solutions to the problem that we are all trying collectively to solve. This is true for energy efficiency in construction as well, as an example. There are a few other sectors where we, at the same time, have technical solutions, we have ongoing innovations, and we are far from having found all that could be done to improve energy production. We also have models that generate revenues and that have been able, over the last 10, 15, or 20 years, to improve so significantly that in some countries where 15 years ago it was not possible to invest into a solar panel field without a public support, today you find the right balance is in place in that country so that private investors can do it on their own. And it's very positive in the way that it helps accelerate the energy transition in those countries. If I compare, for instance, we focus on climate today, but there's another issue which is biodiversity. And biodiversity is much different because we don't have any economic model that generates revenues and that allows us.
You must come to my panel tomorrow.
I'll try.
Ecometrics, where we're going to answer that very point.
No, but it's obviously
2 o'clock
a real problem. How can we protect biodiversity when there's no revenue and when a dead tree has more value than a living tree? That's a question we haven't solved yet. And the carbon permits allow for investors to go into the fight against climate change, but there's still no value to biodiversity certificates, which is probably something that needs to be addressed in the years to come. So for all these reasons, I think that the energy sector is a very powerful way to move forward, and obviously we need to accelerate. We started 4 years ago now the construction of what we call Finance in Common Summit. It's a forum which gathers 530 public development banks worldwide. They represent approximately annually 15% of the total annual world investment. And it's an interesting forum because these institutions are owned by governments. And as being owned by governments, their mandates, be it Paris-aligned or SDG-aligned, are defined by their governments. And what we are trying to achieve now is mobilizing these institutions in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, towards the same direction, which is to convince their government to give them a mandate, which is to invest much more heavily into energy transition and into the deployment of renewable energies. So we are creating coalitions of public development institutions, and we partner with EBRD, with the World Bank, with other public institutions so that they will provide, in some countries, the type of insurance or political insurance, as because there's a political institution that invests together with me as a private investor, I feel a bit de-risked by, and my investment is a bit protected because I'll have some access to the local authorities if a regulation is about to change. So there's a time when the legal environment provides and enables the private sector to work on its own. But there's also a time, a governance, legal transition time, where it's very useful to have public investors working with private investors on a given project and doing it to enable renewables to be deployed much more rapidly.
And I'm just thinking, if you've got these 500 institutions together for this forum, going back to Bruce's first point about standardizing, having a sort of production line mentality when it comes to the contracts, is that, I mean, on the agenda of that forum, is there any discussion of how to make sure that legal frameworks are in place, that they're encouraged, that they're enabling? Well, and if there isn't, maybe there should be.
The debate about standardization is a complex one, because if you look at what the IFRS institutions have been able to do, for instance, it's great because whether you are in Armenia or in China or in the US, when you have a reference which is compatible with the IFRS standards, you can understand what's behind a turnover or a net profit of an organization. So it's great. What has been achieved in that measure is great because it provides visibility, predictability, and transparency on a worldwide basis. Going back to energy production and how we can standardize the legal frameworks, we have much more discrepancies between countries, and we even have difficulties between public institutions to align our own standards, to align our practices, to align our processes on how we deploy our investments. So that's the reason why we are co-financing projects together. It enables us to align our standards. This is also why we are trying to replicate projects that we found in a given place to another place, because the technology is there and is quite similar worldwide. So standardization is an ongoing process, and we need to be encouraged by private players. We need to be encouraged by governments, and this is exactly what we are trying to achieve through this 530 institutions forum, having researchers, having partners who will be able to show the direction and who will be able to drive us to standards that enable the investments to be made.
Great, thank you for that. Now, we're kind of moving into the final segment of this discussion when we're going to be looking forward and discussing what sort of reforms and changes would be most helpful. But let me just turn to a question or two, and thank you to everybody who has submitted them. Okay, let's keep these ones brief, actually. Bruce, you're talking about people as the main impediment to green energy. Are you referring to appeals of individuals or organizations? Just a quick one on that.
People.
Individuals.
Yeah, if we look at some of the projects that I've been involved in, I've been fortunate to have done a whole slew of them. And Militia, she's been involved in them as well. And so we'll come to a new project. We're common actors, but oftentimes there'll be new people from government side, from financier side. And so we often find ourselves trying to educate those individuals and get them on board with what was litigated and agreed in the past, and that's time consuming. Sometimes it's frustrating. You know, I'll say things that I'm not proud of, like I don't have enough crayons to explain to you how this works.
Is that an enabler or a roadblock?
It's a roadblock, but I mean...
Confirmed.
Confirmed.
We are not asking for a concrete example on that specific issue. Huh?
But it's, yeah, to the question, it's individuals. It's personality, ego. It's not at an organizational level.
Right, thank you. One for you, Bob. I mean, it's related, obviously. The extent to which, in your thinking as an EBRD lawyer, the concept of the just transition is part of your thinking, to make sure that whatever is set up, whatever you're working on, actually is supporting that noble goal.
I mean, I think that's sort of central to what we do. You know, we're looking sort of in the near term as well. There's, you know, an importance that whatever is agreed is, you know, sustainable, you know, on a climate level, but also for individual economies. So again, models where too much risk gets put onto the public sector, we appreciate will not be sustainable towards towards deploying a truly green economy, because there are just limits to how much fiscal burden individual governments can take. So it's something that we are very focused on. But it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that if you want to deploy projects in the here and now, as Bruce mentioned, you have to also work with the legal system as it is at this particular moment in time, which sometimes results in a risk allocation which at this very moment in time lenders can get comfortable with in order to to finance projects in particular on a limited recourse basis, where they don't have access to the balance sheets of sponsors if things go wrong.
Great, thanks. Actually, thank you genuinely for these great questions. I'm just going to throw a couple out and we'll see where, I think this is for you, Melissa. I'm going to what are the best ways, practices to influence governments or decision makers to enable them to strive for better legal frameworks for renewables? What are the levers of power or influence, do you think, that work best?
I think it's really for them to understand that clarity and then predictability of the framework are key. And when I say clarity, I don't mean that everything has to be crystal clear. There will be necessarily points that will need to be interpreted. But clarity in relation to how a given project fits into a broader legal framework when it comes to, for example, is it a concession? Is it a PPP? Is it a public procurement? How does it fit in terms of the civil or other security type arrangements, dispute resolution, etc.? So that fit into the general legal framework is really important, and governments need to be clear when they tender the project which way they want to go, because that has a qualification of something as a concession, generated energy and not deemed energy, and all of that. If these basic terms are clear, and if the governments are clear when procuring the project on some of these, maybe 10 key items, that is really, really helpful. And then the other one is really that consistency and that predictability. And again, it doesn't mean that the framework will not evolve, but it does mean that very abrupt changes to the system, let's say you have disappears and everyone was relying on that in terms of the current projects, but also the pipeline, or curtailments of certain power plants that haven't been envisaged are always an issue. So really from the government side, working on that clarity on the key aspects of the legislation and also on the predictability, and giving the investors a little bit of a heads up and of a direction of travel where the country is going.
Right, that's really good.
I think I'd also add to that it's also important to understand how potentially areas within the legal framework which might not be specifically relating to renewable power can actually result in, material delays. So often there will be permits that need to be acquired, or, for example, state aid approvals. And if you're awarding a project, but then actually it takes 2 years or 3 years to get a state aid approval, or there's a very long delay in the granting of construction permits, then even if you've got what on the paper looks like a bankable project that's ready to proceed, you can end up getting kind of caught up with these other things which aren't always at the forefront of people's minds. And secondly, sort of related to that, we often find that issues relating to land acquisition can be a very kind of material challenge and can lead to important, like significant delays. And again, there's a environmental and social, very important environmental and social aspect to securing the land rights for not only the siting of the plant, but also for any transmission lines, which has an environmental and social dimension, but also from a lender's perspective, they need to know that title to the land has been validly acquired, or at least, appropriate leasehold rights and security. And again, we often find that those processes are very, very complex and time-consuming, understandably, because you can be traveling fairly significant distances. But if you don't factor that in at the time when projects are being awarded in the first place, then even when you're kind of ready to go, you can find yourself waiting for these other areas to catch up, and So, something which I think we come across quite a lot, especially on kind of first-in-country projects where you're discovering these issues as you go along.
We've covered some of the points and arguments about looking ahead, what needs to happen, but let's review or tap into new ones. And I'll just go along the line, starting with you, Bruce. And by the way, actually, a question came in for you, which you needn't answer, but who handles the crayons? And I guess we all have a responsibility to help with the awareness raising and education of everybody we encounter. I've answered that for you, unless you want to jump in on that. But if you wanted to identify one or two things in a sort of brief remarks about what kind of reforms, looking ahead, would most answer the needs that you've set up so vividly?
Like a practical example of the roadblocks that we would face as we go into a new country, and when we do so, we would typically sign a investment agreement or a joint development agreement, some very high-level heads of terms, and it would be agreed as part of that what kind of legal framework should be adopted for the project, with suitable modifications to suit the existing laws of the country, banking regulations, etc. So, for example, we might say, we've done a bunch of projects in Uzbekistan very successfully. Let's adopt the same model and make those modifications for your country. Agreed. The procurer will go off and hire an expensive law firm like a Clifford Chance or a White & Case, and then what's actually presented to you in full form has a whole bunch of changes which depart from what had been agreed upon, which have no relationship with the existing laws of the country or banking regulations. They amount to sort of simple efforts to try to improve the position from the procurer's side, probably to a large extent led by the law firm that's advising them. And then what happens more often than not is you spend months and months and months and lots of legal fees on your side as well, negotiating the model, only to arrive at exactly what you had agreed upon like 9 months before. Okay, I'm going to shut you off there because I need to fit everybody in for this last round. But you've made that point very, very colourfully and powerfully, if I may say. Bob, picking up on that, what is the one thing looking ahead you regard as if you like, critical?
I think it's probably a point that I made previously about the fact that really if we're going to have an economy that allows for, much greater electrification, there'll have to be, a huge scale up of renewable energy, and trying to do that in a way which is actually fiscally sustainable is, I think, the real challenge. So looking at ways in which you can, take some of this financial exposure off the state. And so what we've seen in markets which have been liberalised and where you have competitive wholesale markets, again, enabling sales to the market, admittedly often with a price stabilisation mechanism, for example, a contract for difference, is something, is one way of reducing that burden. But at the same time, we need to try and do that in a way where you can't wait for, if we were all waiting for these competitive wholesale markets to emerge, I think going back to Bruce's example of the boiling frog, we'll be waiting forever. So there are ways in which, we are exploring conversion mechanisms in some jurisdictions, for example, Albania and Moldova, where you can start with a fixed price PPA, but then move at some point in the future to a contract for difference, which again, reduces some of the burden for the state.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Melissa. A final brief thought.
I think it's a lot also about planning, and on the government side, trying to recognize as well, and I think people are recognizing the urgency of, and so setting short-term, medium-term, long-term plans with exactly the objectives, and then actually demonstrated how those objectives can be delivered and are being delivered, so that the investors and the financiers can look ahead at the particular country or a particular region and understand where that country or that region are going. Would be my
okay, great. Bertrand, you began. We'll end with you. we've heard a lot of very practical issues discussed here in this last hour. What for you stands out as the thing that you would most like to see reformed or changed for the future? And this is just in a minute, I'm afraid.
Well, referring to Bruce's remark, I think it's very interesting. The example of Uzbekistan is very interesting. There has been several projects that we're conducting there. So what are the lessons that can be taken from those projects, and how those lessons can transform into law, regulation, anything that then prevents people from starting the whole process all over again of negotiating the contract and so on. This is something that with EBRD and with private players and with others we could certainly do in many countries. That's one thing. The second one is the
second one has to be very, very,
very cool. The Just Energy Transition Partnership, because I just wanted to echo what Bob was saying. Just transition is very important in all we do, because as an example, we're having this discussion in South Africa where going for renewable in a much larger scale than what is in place today means closing coal mines where tens of thousands of people are employed. And this is obviously something, when you think about the energy mix in 5 or 10 years, that you have to take into consideration right now, because either for ego reasons or for just money reasons, people will not follow you on the renewable path.
I'm going to have to wrap it. I mean, that's a very exciting project there, partly because of its scale. I think it's mirrored by others in Indonesia, and possibly Vietnam. So, I mean, we wish all that well. I'm afraid we've got to wrap up. It's been a really action-packed. We've done frogs, we've done all kinds of things, we've done crayons. Would you all join me in thanking a terrific panel? Thank you.